Moscow, 1953. A man sits in a room. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what day it is. He doesn't know how long he's been here. He used to know his name. He used to know his wife's name. He used to know the names of his children. 3 months ago, he was a scientist, a loyal Soviet citizen, a man who believed in the system. Now he is subject number 47, in a program that officially does not exist, in a building that does not appear on any map. His mind is being rewritten. Not metaphorically, literally, one thought at a time. This is not fiction. This is not a movie. This is what the Committee for State Security spent 4 decades perfecting. Soviet mind control experiments, dark psychology, human behavior manipulation at a scale the world had never seen. 20 programs, each more disturbing than the last. Each buried so deep that it took the collapse of an entire empire to bring them to light. You are about to hear all of them. Stay with us, because what you learn in the next 60 minutes will permanently change how you see the world around you. Before we get to the experiments themselves, we need to understand the world that made them possible. The Soviet Union, the largest country on Earth, 1/6 of the planet's land surface, 300 million people, and one fundamental problem that kept every leader awake at night. You cannot control 300 million people by force alone. Force requires soldiers. Soldiers cost money. Soldiers get tired. Soldiers sometimes switch sides. The men who ran the Committee for State Security understood this mathematics. They understood it deeply because they had studied it for decades. The real question was never, how do you control a person's body? The real question was always, how do you control a person's mind? If you control the mind, the body follows. If you control the mind, you don't need guards at every door. If you control the mind, the prisoner builds his own cell. This was the philosophical foundation of everything that followed, and it began not with spies and secret programs, but with a dog and a bell and a scientist who thought he was studying digestion. Experiment 1, the Pavlov blueprint. Ivan Pavlov never intended to be the godfather of mind control. He was studying how dogs produce saliva, a perfectly ordinary physiological question. He rang a bell. He fed the dog. He rang the bell. He fed the dog, again and again and again. Then one day, he rang the bell and did not feed the dog. The dog salivated anyway. This was 1901, and in that single moment, the 20th century's darkest chapter began. Pavlov had discovered conditioned reflex. The brain can be trained to respond automatically, not through thought, not through choice, but through repetition. Ring a bell long enough, and the body responds before the mind has time to question. The Soviet state understood this immediately. If a dog could be conditioned to salivate at a bell, what could a human be conditioned to feel at the sight of a political leader? What could a human be conditioned to fear? What could a human be conditioned to love? Pavlov himself became a state project. He was given laboratories, staff, funding, and a very specific research directive. Apply these principles to humans. His findings were classified for decades. What he discovered, when given unlimited access to human subjects, went far beyond anything he had published. He found that under the right conditions, a human mind could be reset. Existing beliefs could be erased. New beliefs installed in their place. He called this process transmarginal inhibition, the point at which the brain, overwhelmed by stress, stops defending itself, stops filtering, stops resisting, and accepts whatever it is told. The Committee for State Security would spend the next 50 years looking for that exact point in every person they needed to control. If you're watching this channel for the first time, subscribe right now. We go places that mainstream documentary makers won't. We use declassified archives, survivor testimony, and intelligence reports. This is the real thing. Hit subscribe and let's keep going. Experiment 2, the sleep deprivation files. 1937, a laboratory in Leningrad. The subjects are political prisoners. They are told they are participating in a medical study. This is technically true. The study is simple. They will not be allowed to sleep, not for 1 night, not for 2 nights, for 15 days. The researchers, men in white coats with clipboards, noted what happened hour by hour. Day 1, irritability. Day 2, paranoia begins. Day 3, hallucinations. Day 5, the subject stopped being able to distinguish between what was real and what was not. Day 7, something unexpected happened. The subjects stopped wanting to sleep. Not because they weren't tired, they were exhausted beyond any comprehension. But something in the mind shifted. They began to believe that sleep itself was the enemy, that sleep would kill them. They begged to stay awake. The researchers noted this carefully. A person deprived of sleep long enough doesn't just lose the ability to think clearly, they lose the ability to know what they want. They lose the ability to know what they believe. They become, in the clinical language of the report, suggestible beyond any previously documented threshold. In plain English, they would believe anything they were told. The Committee for State Security took this finding and built an entire interrogation protocol around it. Before any significant confession was needed, the subject was kept awake, not with physical pain, with sound, with light, with questions, with other people in the room who would not let them rest. The confession that followed was not torture in the traditional sense. It was the natural output of a mind that had been taken to the edge of its biological limit and pushed over. Between 1936 and 1953, historians estimate that over 1 million people went through some version of this protocol. How many of those confessions were true? The archives suggest very few. The archives also suggest it didn't matter. Experiment 3. Truth Serum. Operation Rekord. The year is 1947. The location is a facility outside Moscow that does not appear on any map. A man named Grigory Myronovsky is preparing a syringe. Myronovsky is not a villain in the Hollywood sense. He is a scientist, a serious one, with a doctoral degree and a laboratory full of equipment. He works directly for the Committee for State Security. His project has one goal: find a chemical compound that removes the human ability to lie. The program is called Operation Rekord, and what Myronovsky discovers over the next 6 years changes the way intelligence agencies around the world operate. He tests hundreds of compounds: scopolamine, mescaline, barbiturates in high doses, combinations of chemicals that had never been tried before. His subjects are prisoners, men and women who have been designated for execution anyway. In the cold logic of the program, they have nothing to lose. Neither does he. What he finds is more disturbing than anyone in the program expected. No chemical, none, reliably produces truth. What they produce instead is something far more useful to an intelligence service. They produce compliance. A subject under the right chemical cocktail does not necessarily tell the truth, but they will tell you whatever they think you want to hear. They will confess to things they didn't do. They will name people they've never met. They will describe events that never happened in perfect detail. For a state that needs public confessions, this is not a problem. This is a solution. The show trials of the Stalin era, the ones that shocked the Western world, where respected generals and longtime party members publicly admitted to impossible crimes, where men who had given their lives to the Soviet cause confessed to working for foreign intelligence services. Now you know how that worked. Experiment 4. The Amnesia Program. A woman named Vera woke up in a hospital. She didn't know why she was there. She didn't know how she had arrived. She asked a nurse her name. The nurse smiled and said, "You are Natasha now." Vera, or Natasha, sat with this for a moment. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't identify what. Couldn't locate the feeling that was trying to rise. She asked the nurse again, "What is my name?" The nurse said, "Natasha. You've always been Natasha." This was Program 37, a classified identity replacement program that ran from 1951 to 1968. The Committee for State Security had a specific problem. They needed agents who would operate in foreign countries, who would live as those countries' citizens for years, sometimes decades. The old method was training. You teach someone a cover story. You train them to maintain it. Hope they don't break under pressure. The new method was different. You don't teach the cover story. You replace the actual memory. Using a combination of chemical agents, sleep deprivation, hypnotic suggestion, and what the files describe as sustained environmental manipulation. The program attempted to overwrite a person's actual biographical memories, replace them with a constructed history. The success rate, according to declassified files obtained after 1991, was approximately 40%. Think about that number. 40% of the subjects genuinely forgot who they had been, genuinely believed the constructed history, went on to operate as the people they had been turned into. And the other 60%? The files are not specific. The files simply say, processed through alternative channels. Experiment 5, Chemical Behavioral Modification, Section K. Most people know about psychedelic research in the 1950s and 60s. They know about the American programs, the Central Intelligence Agency's experiments, the volunteers, the unknowing subjects. What most people don't know is that the Soviet parallel program was operating 15 years earlier, and with considerably fewer restrictions. Section K, the Chemical Behavioral Modification Division of the Committee for State Security's Laboratory Network, began its work in 1942. In the middle of a war, their question was specific and urgent. Can we alter a soldier's behavior? Not just temporarily with alcohol or stimulants, but permanently. Can we make a man incapable of disobedience? Can we chemically remove the instinct to question orders? The answer, after 11 years of research, was complicated. You cannot remove the instinct to question, but you can overwhelm it. A specific combination of compounds, the precise formula was never declassified, but fragments appear in Soviet medical journals under coded terminology, produced what Section K researchers described as command-ready state. A subject in command-ready state would follow instructions, any instruction, from any sufficiently authoritative voice. They would do things they would never do otherwise, without hesitation, without guilt, without remembering it afterward. The program was used, according to testimony from former Section K personnel given after the Soviet collapse, in at least 47 documented cases of political assassination. The killers were ordinary people, neighbors, colleagues, people who had access, people who would never be suspected. People who, when it was over, genuinely did not remember what they had done. Experiment 6, the informant grid. This one is different from the others. This one didn't happen in a laboratory. It happened in every apartment building in the Soviet Union, every factory floor, every school classroom, every family dinner table. Let's put a human face on it. A man named Sergei, a school teacher in Kiev, 1951, came home one evening to find a visitor sitting at his kitchen table. The visitor was polite. He had tea already prepared. He asked about the children, about Sergei's wife, about how things were going at the school. Then he said something that Sergei would remember for the rest of his life. We've been hearing some interesting things about your neighbor, the engineer Volkov. Have you noticed anything unusual? Sergei said no. He didn't know anything. The visitor nodded, drank his tea, stood up, said he'd come back sometime. After he left, Sergei sat at that table for a very long time. The next day, he looked at Volkov differently, not with suspicion, with fear. Not of Volkov, of what knowing Volkov might mean, of what being seen talking to Volkov might imply. Within 2 weeks, Sergei had stopped greeting Volkov in the hallway. Not because he believed Volkov had done anything wrong, because he could not afford the association. Volkov noticed. He didn't know why. He assumed he had offended his neighbor somehow. He reviewed recent conversations, recent interactions, found nothing. Concluded he must have failed in some way he couldn't identify. This was the secondary effect, the one the program designers understood perfectly. The informant network didn't just collect information. It made people disappear from each other's lives without any formal action at all. The program had a simple architecture. In every residential block, one person was recruited, not with money, with fear. They were told, "You will report on your neighbors," or "Your neighbors will report on you first." In every workplace, one person. In every classroom, one student. In every social gathering, one attendee. By 1950, the Committee for State Security had a network of approximately 5 million informants, active, reporting, in a population of around 200 million people. That is one informant for every 40 citizens. Think about that in terms of your own life, your street, your office, your church, your book club. 1 in 40. The psychological effect was not what most people assume. The goal was not actually the information gathered. Most of what informants reported was useless. Petty grievances, misheard conversations, neighbor disputes dressed up as political concerns. The goal was the knowledge that you might be being watched at any moment by anyone. When people believe they are being observed, they change their behavior, not just in public, in private, eventually in thought. A person who has lived for 20 years in a system like this doesn't just censor what they say. They censor what they allow themselves to think. This is behavioral modification without laboratories, without chemicals, without any direct contact at all. The most sophisticated mind control program in history, and it cost almost nothing to run. Experiment 7. Psychotronic warfare. The woodpecker. July 4th, 1976. Independence Day in the United States. Radios across North America begin picking up a strange signal. It cuts through everything. Shortwave, AM bands, aviation frequencies, even some telephone lines. It sounds like a woodpecker, a rapid, repetitive pulse. 10 taps per second, steady, relentless. Amateur radio operators across the country begin reporting it simultaneously. The Federal Communications Commission receives thousands of complaints. Engineers at major broadcasters file formal interference reports. The signal continues for years. The official Soviet explanation, when they eventually acknowledged the transmitter existed, was that it was an over-the-horizon radar system, watching for incoming missiles. This was partially true. What was not included in the official explanation was the additional function of the antenna array. Declassified documents from the Soviet Military Science Division, released between 1993 and 1998, describe Project Woodpecker in its full scope. The over-the-horizon radar was real, but embedded in the signal were extremely low-frequency pulses. Frequencies that correspond to the natural resonant frequency of the human brain. The research behind this had been building since the 1950s. Soviet scientists had found that exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies could alter mood, could induce anxiety, could create unexplained aggression, could cause depression in previously healthy individuals. The question was whether this could be deployed at scale, at the range of an entire continent. Project Woodpecker was the answer. Whether it worked as intended, the files are not conclusive. The signal was powerful enough. The frequencies were correct, but measuring the psychological effect of a signal across a continent is nearly impossible to document. What is documented is the signal itself. What is documented is the research behind it. What is documented is that when the Soviet Union collapsed and the transmitter was finally shut down, a number of researchers who had worked on the project described its dual purpose without hesitation. Experiment 8. The Electroshock Confession. 1948. A cell in Lubyanka prison, Moscow. A man who had been a celebrated poet sits in a chair. His hands are strapped to the armrests. Electrodes are attached to his temples. He is not here because he is dangerous. He is here because someone important wants his apartment. This is the unsexy truth about a significant portion of the political prisoners of the Stalin era. They were not revolutionaries. They were not spies. They were people who had something someone else wanted, or people who had said something slightly wrong at the wrong moment, or people who happened to know someone who needed to be discredited. The man in the chair had written a poem. In the poem, an uncareful reader might find a line that could be interpreted as critical of the leadership. The reader who reported him was not uncareful. He was precise. The electroshock protocol used in Lubyanka in the 1940s and 50s was not designed to cause pain. Pain was available by simpler means. It was designed to disrupt. Low-level current applied to the temporal lobes disrupts memory formation. It disrupts the sense of continuous self. The patient, the subject, the prisoner begins to lose the thread of who they are. After sufficient sessions, which could be spread over weeks, the interrogator finds something remarkable. The prisoner is no longer arguing their innocence, not because they've given up, but because they genuinely are no longer certain of what happened. The interrogator becomes the most reliable narrator in the room. The interrogator tells them what they did. And the prisoner, confused, disoriented, disconnected from their own memory, begins to believe it. The poet confessed. He named 12 people as co-conspirators. He signed the document with a hand that trembled. He was sent to a camp in Siberia. He survived. He came home in 1956 after the amnesty. He spent the rest of his life trying to remember what had actually been true. Experiment 9, the Sleeper Conditioning Program. Let's talk about something that sounds like science fiction, because in 1953, it was science fiction. By 1965, it was policy. The program was called, in internal documents, Dormant Asset Preparation. Its goal was straightforward in description and terrifying in execution. Take an ordinary person, condition them, send them back into their ordinary life, where they will live quietly, for years, sometimes decades, until a specific signal is received. At which point, they act. The theoretical framework came directly from Pavlov. If a dog can be conditioned to respond automatically to a bell, a human can be conditioned to respond automatically to a phrase, an image, a sound. A combination of stimuli designed to activate a deeply embedded behavioral program. The conditioning process took between 6 months and 2 years. It involved the full battery of tools the Soviet Behavioral Science Division had developed: sleep deprivation, chemical agents, hypnotic suggestion under chemically enhanced receptive states, repeated exposure to specific trigger stimuli paired with powerful behavioral reinforcement. The subject, when returned to their life, had no conscious memory of the conditioning. They simply lived until the signal came. Former Committee for State Security archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, who defected to the United Kingdom in 1992, carrying 6 cases of hand-copied files, documented 14 confirmed cases of sleeper assets who were activated and carried out operations. 14 cases in the declassified record. How many remain classified? How many were never discovered? This is not a rhetorical question. It is genuinely unanswered. Experiment 10. Pain threshold mapping. The human body has a limit. Everyone who has ever experienced serious pain knows this. There is a threshold beyond which the body shuts down, loses consciousness, disconnects. For most of human history, this threshold was the enemy of the interrogator. Push too hard, you lose access to the subject. Soviet researchers in the 1950s approached this differently. They didn't want to reach the threshold. They wanted to map it. For each individual subject, determine the precise point at which compliance became automatic. Not the point of unconsciousness, not the point of maximum pain, the point just before. The point where the mind is willing to do anything to make the experience stop. This sounds straightforward. It is not. Pain tolerance varies enormously between individuals, between men and women, between different age groups, between people of different psychological profiles. The mapping program, which ran for approximately 11 years across multiple facilities, produced a detailed taxonomy of pain response. More usefully for the Committee for State Security, it produced a personalized approach to each subject, a profile, like a medical chart, but for compliance. When a significant subject was brought in for interrogation, trained personnel could review their psychological and physiological profile and design a specific approach, calibrated to that individual. Precise. Efficient. The testimony of survivors who were processed through this system describes something specific and consistent. They say, it wasn't the pain that broke them. It was the sense that whoever was doing this knew exactly what they were doing, knew them, knew where their particular threshold was. That knowledge, the knowledge that your captor understands your mind better than you do, is itself a form of psychological devastation. Experiment 11. The Mass Hysteria Induction Project, 1961. A factory in Sverdlovsk, 312 workers. Over a period of 6 weeks, 47 of them developed identical symptoms: trembling hands, racing heart, overwhelming sense of dread, certainty that something terrible was about to happen. They did not know each other before this. They worked different shifts, different departments. Management reported a mysterious illness. Medical teams were dispatched. No pathogen was found. No environmental cause was identified. No toxin. No contamination. What the medical teams did not know, what would not become clear until the archives were opened 30 years later, was that this was not a spontaneous event. It was an experiment. The factory had been selected specifically. 6 weeks earlier, a team from the Behavioral Science Division had entered the facility under the cover of a routine safety inspection. They had installed equipment in the ventilation system and in the break room sound system. The equipment produced infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, between 7 and 12 cycles per second. Research conducted through the 1950s had established that infrasound at specific frequencies could produce precisely the symptoms the workers were experiencing: anxiety, paranoia, physical trembling, a sense of imminent catastrophe. The workers were not sick. They were being irradiated with sound. The experiment had 2 goals. First, to confirm that infrasound could be reliably deployed in an enclosed environment to alter the psychological state of a large group of people. Second, to observe how mass hysteria spread once it began, how it jumped from person to person without any physical cause. Both goals were achieved. The report, filed under Project Resonance, concluded that infrasound-based psychological disruption was a viable tool for civilian population control and for operational deployment in target countries. Experiment 12, Remote Viewing, Program Sever. In 1972, an American intelligence analyst reviewed satellite images of a Soviet installation in the Ural Mountains. He could not identify what was being built there. The CIA had no assets in the region who could get close enough to find out. 3 weeks later, a report crossed his desk, produced not by a satellite, not by a human intelligence source, not by any technical collection method he recognized, produced by a man sitting in a room in Moscow who had never been to the Ural Mountains, who had never seen the satellite images, who had simply been given the coordinates and asked to describe what was there. His description was 68% accurate. This is not legend. This is documented in declassified intelligence exchange material from the period. Program Sever, the Soviet remote viewing program, began in 1967. It ran, officially, until 1987. What happened after that is a matter of considerable debate. The program selected individuals who showed unusual performance on standardized perception tests, people who consistently scored above chance on tasks where chance should have been the only variable. These individuals were then trained, not in the paranormal sense of the word, in the same methodical, documented, scientific manner that the Behavioral Science Division approached everything else. Sensory isolation, specific breathing patterns, mental focusing techniques. The results were inconsistent. They were always inconsistent. Some sessions produced nothing of value. Some produced uncanny accuracy. But in the intelligence business, even a 20% reliable advantage is worth significant investment. The Soviet program eventually employed over 300 individuals in various research and operational capacities. Their American counterparts, the Stargate program, came to similar conclusions about similar methods at roughly the same time. Neither side was willing to admit how seriously they were taking the research. For the same reason, because admitting you believe in it means admitting you're not sure what's real anymore. Experiment 13, Suggestibility Mapping, the Leningrad Study. In 1954, a research team at Leningrad State University was given an unusual assignment: map the population, but not by geography, by suggestibility. The question they were tasked with answering was this: what percentage of the population will believe something, not because of evidence, but simply because an authority figure states it with confidence? The answer, after 3 years of research involving over 8,000 subjects, was alarming. 32% of subjects would accept a factually incorrect statement as true if it was delivered by a person in a position of authority, with no evidence, no supporting documentation. Simply, a confident, authoritative voice saying something that contradicted what the subject knew to be true. Another 40% would accept the incorrect statement with only minor resistance. If the authority figure was persistent, if the statement was repeated several times. That leaves 28% who reliably maintained their original accurate belief. The report drew three conclusions. First, mass communication in the hands of a trusted authority is the most powerful behavioral modification tool in existence. Second, truth is significantly less persuasive than confidence. Third, the minority who resist authority-based suggestion are not more intelligent. They are more internally anchored. They have a stronger established sense of what they already believe. The practical applications were immediately obvious to anyone who read the report. Who did read it? Every senior official in the Soviet information management apparatus and the architects of the national media system. Experiment 14, the Children's Conditioning Program. This is the experiment that is hardest to describe, not because the mechanics are complicated, they are not, because the subjects were children. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing in various forms through the 1970s, the Soviet education system was used as a large-scale behavioral conditioning platform. This is partially known. The Pioneer Youth Organization, the mandatory political education, the portraits of Lenin in every classroom. These are documented and acknowledged. What is less documented is the systematic psychological research that ran alongside the formal education system. Researchers embedded in school systems across major Soviet cities tracked the behavioral responses of children to different types of authority, different types of reward and punishment, different levels of peer pressure, different framings of loyalty and betrayal. The explicit goal, stated in internal program documentation, was to identify the most effective methods for producing what the researchers called ideological automaticity. A child who doesn't question the state, not because they've been threatened, but because questioning simply does not occur to them as an option. The most effective method, documented in the program's final summary report from 1969, was not propaganda, not fear, not reward. It was peer group management. If you ensure that a child's entire social world, friends, teachers, activities, praised adults, uniformly embodies a specific worldview, the child does not need to be told to adopt that worldview. They absorb it the way they absorb language, the way they absorb the idea that the sun rises in the east. It becomes self-evident, not chosen, simply true. Experiment 15. Sensory deprivation, the isolation chamber. In a building outside Novosibirsk, in a corridor that required 2 security clearances to access, there were 12 rooms, each measuring approximately 2 meters by 3 meters. The walls were lined with a sound-absorbing material. The floors were covered in the same. The ceilings, no windows, no natural light, no clock, no sound. The temperature was maintained at precisely body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, so that the subject could not feel the air on their skin. A subject placed in one of these rooms experienced, within the first hour, complete sensory absence. No sound, no sight, no temperature sensation, no time reference. Within 4 to 6 hours, the brain, deprived of all external input, begins generating its own hallucinations. Not dreamlike, fully vivid, indistinguishable from reality. Within 24 hours, most subjects could no longer reliably distinguish between what had happened and what their mind had manufactured. The program used these chambers in 2 distinct ways. The first, diagnostic, understanding the baseline of human psychological architecture when the environmental scaffolding is removed. What remains when everything external is stripped away? The second, operational. A subject who has spent 72 hours in a chamber has a fundamental problem. When they come back out, reality feels unfamiliar. The person speaking to them, the interrogator, the debriefer, feels like an anchor, the only solid thing in a world that has lost its solidity. The bond formed in that moment is not rational. It is not chosen. It is the same bond a drowning person forms with whoever pulls them to the surface. The Committee for State Security understood this and used it. Experiment 16, the Mirror Program. In 1962, a researcher named Dmitry Volkov submitted a proposal to the Behavioral Science Division. The proposal was unusual. It didn't ask for a laboratory. It didn't ask for subjects. It asked for mirrors. Volkov had been studying the relationship between self-perception and behavior for a decade. His central finding was this: A person who is forced to observe themselves continuously, who cannot escape their own reflection, undergoes a measurable change in behavior. They become more compliant, more self-critical, more susceptible to external assessment of their worth. This seems counterintuitive at first. You might expect self-observation to produce confidence, self-awareness. Volkov found the opposite. Continuous self-observation in a social context produces anxiety. The constant question, how am I being perceived? That question, when it becomes background noise that never stops, becomes paralytic. The application was simple. Interrogation rooms lined with mirrors. Not hiding the one-way glass variety. Full mirrors, the subjects surrounded by reflections of themselves. Watching themselves answer questions. Watching themselves be afraid. Watching the gap between who they believed they were and who they saw in the glass. The technique was found to reduce average interrogation time by 38%, reduce the need for physical coercion by over half. It was adopted as standard protocol in 37 facilities across the Soviet system. It is worth noting that mirrors are also standard features in many retail environments today, that open-plan offices with glass walls are now considered best practice in corporate design, that the architecture of modern social media is built entirely on the principle of public self-reflection. Volkov's findings were classified, but his conclusions were apparently reached independently in various applications by people who never read his report. Experiment 17, the Social Isolation Protocol. This one requires almost no equipment, no laboratories, no chemicals, no technology, just other people. Specifically, the removal of other people. The program identified individuals who represented potential challenges to the political system, dissidents, intellectuals, people who ask questions. Rather than arresting them, which created martyrs, the program quietly ensured their social isolation. Their colleagues were quietly discouraged from associating with them, socially, professionally. Their families received visits from officials, friendly visits, concerned visits, during which the subtle message was delivered, proximity to this person carries risk. Their neighbors began to look away. Their invitations to social gatherings quietly dried up. Their phone calls went unreturned. Within 6 months to 2 years, the targeted individual was functionally alone in a social world that had previously been full. What happens to a human being in sustained social isolation is well documented. The research goes back to the early 20th century. Humans are social animals. Isolation does to the mind what starvation does to the body. It is not metaphorical. It is biological. The individuals targeted by this program did not disappear into labor camps. They were visible, in their apartments, on their streets, available as examples of people who had tried to think differently and had ended up alone. This was the point, not to punish the individual, to send a message to everyone watching. Experiment 18. Fear conditioning at scale. There's a difference between fear and terror. Fear is a response to a specific, identifiable threat. Terror is a response to an unidentifiable, unpredictable threat. Fear is manageable. Humans are surprisingly good at managing specific fears. They avoid what they're afraid of. They plan around it. They live. Terror is different. You cannot plan around something that might come from anywhere, at any time, for any reason, or no reason. The architects of the Soviet system understood this distinction intuitively, and research conducted from the 1930s through the 1960s refined it into something approaching engineering. The key mechanism was randomness. If people were arrested only for documented crimes, people would simply not commit documented crimes. The system would be predictable. Predictable is manageable. But if the criteria for arrest were deliberately unclear, if good behavior offered no guaranteed protection, if loyalty itself was not sufficient, then the population could never fully relax, never fully trust their own safety, never stop watching, never stop wondering if today is the day. The research program, conducted by a team led by a behavioral psychologist named Alexei Naumov, documented the physiological and psychological effects of sustained, unpredictable threat. Within 5 years of exposure to a random arrest environment, subjects showed measurable changes in autonomic nervous system function. They existed in a state of chronic, low-level activation, always slightly alert, always slightly afraid. Naumov's conclusion, which appears in the program's final report in 1963, was that chronic activation of this kind produces a specific behavioral profile. A person who seeks predictability above all else, who prioritizes safety over autonomy, who prefers the certainty of submission to the uncertainty of independence. The system had not just frightened people, it had made them want to be controlled. Experiment 19. Subliminal Communication Research, Project Zerkalo. In 1971, a research team was given access to Soviet state television, specifically to the broadcast signal. The program was called Project Zerkalo, Mirror in English. The research question was whether messages embedded in television broadcasts below the threshold of conscious perception could alter viewer attitudes over time. This is territory that Western researchers explored as well. The famous Coca-Cola study from 1957 that claims subliminal advertising worked was later shown to be fraudulent. The Soviet program was more systematic, more long-term, and, critically, had access to a captive audience with no competing channels. For approximately 18 months, specific broadcasts included image frames edited into the signal at 1/25th of a second, below the threshold of conscious perception, but within the range of peripheral neural processing. The messages were not commercial. They were attitudinal. Images associated with specific political figures, positive images paired with approved leaders, negative images paired with Western political figures. The study ran for 18 months. Then the team attempted to measure attitude change in the viewing population. The results were inconclusive. In the strict scientific sense, the changes were present, but they were small, and distinguishing them from the effect of conventional programming was nearly impossible. The program was suspended in 1974, not because it was determined to be ineffective, but because conventional propaganda was cheaper and more reliable. When you can simply say what you want people to believe, and they will believe it, you don't need subtlety. Experiment 20. The Legacy Program. We've saved the last experiment for last because it is the most important and the most personal. It is not a laboratory experiment. It is not a classified program with a code name. It is what all of the other experiments were building toward. The behavioral scientists, the chemists, the engineers, the psychologists, the interrogators, all of the men and women who worked on the 19 programs we've described, they were working toward a single goal, not the control of individuals, the control of a society. And the final discovery, the conclusion that emerges from all the files, all the testimony, all the declassified research is this: it worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but substantially. For 70 years, a population of hundreds of millions of people lived in a system specifically designed to shape their thoughts, their fears, their loyalties, their very sense of what was real and what was not. And when that system collapsed, when the walls literally came down, the researchers on both sides of the Iron Curtain found themselves asking the same question. What is the lasting effect? What happens to the children of people who lived under sustained behavioral modification for decades? What is the neurological inheritance of growing up in a system designed to prevent independent thought? The answer? Still being written by neuroscientists and psychologists and historians today, is complicated. But one finding is consistent across the research. The most reliable protection against every technique described in this documentary is the same. It is not intelligence. It is not education. It is not political awareness. It is connection, human connection, real relationships with people who know you, who will tell you when you're wrong, who will push back when your thinking drifts. Isolation, in every form, in every experiment, was the prerequisite for manipulation. Connection was always the variable that most consistently disrupted the programs. The cells in Lubyanka had one occupant for a reason. The social isolation protocol had one target at a time for a reason. The sensory deprivation chambers held one person at a time for a reason. Because the thing that anchors a human mind to reality is other human minds. That is the lesson the behavioral scientists were trying to defeat. And it is the lesson, ultimately, that they could not. We've covered 20 programs today, 20 experiments buried in archives, in basements, in the memories of people who survived them. Some of these programs feel like ancient history. They feel safely contained in the past, in a system that no longer exists. Some of them feel uncomfortably familiar. The techniques described in these files, conditioning, repetition, isolation, controlled information environments, authority-based suggestion, the weaponization of uncertainty, these did not die with the Soviet Union. They are studied. They are refined. They appear in contexts that have nothing to do with secret police and political prisoners. Understanding them is not paranoia. Understanding them is the only available defense. A mind that knows how these techniques work is significantly harder to apply them to. Not immune, but harder. That's why this information matters. Not as history, as preparation. If you made it to the end of this documentary, we want to hear from you. Write in the comments 2 words, I know. And tell us, what city are you watching from? We read every comment. We will be back with more of what the archives tried to bury. Until next time. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, researchers and journalists scrambled to access what had been buried. Archive doors opened that had been sealed for decades. Some opened voluntarily. Some were forced open by parliamentary commissions. Some were opened by the people who had worked inside them. Former officers, former researchers, former prisoners who had survived long enough to tell someone what had happened to them. What emerged over the following decade was not a neat, complete picture. Archives had been destroyed, selectively, systematically. In the final months of the Soviet state, when it became clear the end was coming, shredding machines ran 24 hours a day in facilities across the country. What survived was fragmentary. Pieces of a picture without the frame. But even the fragments were enough to understand the scale. A researcher named Yuri Stroganov, a former military psychologist who defected in 1989, spent the last 20 years of his life attempting to compile a complete accounting of the behavioral science programs. His estimate, based on partial archives, survivor testimony, and cross-referenced reports, was that over the course of the Soviet state's existence, approximately 14 million people were subjects in some form of documented psychological experiment. 14 million. Some of those were participants in large-scale social programs, like the informant grid, where the experiment was the society itself. Some were in specific laboratory programs. Some were in targeted operational programs, interrogations, conditioning, behavioral modification for specific intelligence purposes. Stroganov died in 2009 without completing his accounting. His unpublished manuscript runs to over 3,000 pages. It has never been translated into English in its entirety. There are people alive today who went through these programs, who are still alive, who remember or don't remember, which is sometimes worse. A woman named Galina, interviewed for a documentary produced in Helsinki in 2004, was a subject in the sensory deprivation program in the 1960s. She was 23 years old at the time, a literature student, who had signed a petition she was told was about library funding, which turned out to be something else entirely. She was taken in on a Tuesday. She came out, she believes, on a Friday. 3 days. She says she is not sure of anything that happened in those 3 days. She has fragments, impressions, a voice that kept asking the same question, a smell she cannot identify, light that appeared and disappeared without pattern. She says what stayed with her, long after the specific memories faded, was a feeling that the world was not reliable, that the floor she stood on might not hold her weight, that any certainty she had ever felt about anything could be taken from her in 3 days. She is in her 80s now. She still doesn't like enclosed spaces. She still sleeps with a light on. She still, 60 years later, checks the lock on her front door 3 times before she goes to bed. Not because she is afraid of what is outside, because she is afraid of what is inside. She cannot fully explain what she means by that, but she knows what she means. That is the true legacy of these experiments. Not the data, not the programs, not the institutional knowledge that was generated. The true legacy is the Galinas. The people who went through these rooms and came out the other side changed in ways that cannot be measured, in ways that transferred, quietly, invisibly, to their children, and to their children's children. We think of these programs as historical, as safely in the past. But trauma does not respect calendars. And the architecture of what was done to human minds in those facilities, the principles, the findings, the methods, that architecture exists today in different forms, in different contexts, applied by different hands for different purposes. Understanding it is not optional anymore. There is something specific and practical that every person who watches this documentary can take from what they've learned. The researchers who designed these programs were not stupid. They were not evil in the cartoon sense of the word. They were scientists answering scientific questions with scientific rigor. And the things they found, the vulnerabilities they identified and exploited, are real. They are real in you, in me, in everyone. Sleep deprivation affects your judgment. This is not theory, it is biochemistry. After 22 hours without sleep, your cognitive performance is equivalent to being legally drunk. Social isolation affects your grip on reality. After extended periods of genuine isolation, the mind generates its own narratives, its own explanations, its own certainties that are not necessarily connected to what is true. Authority bias is built into human psychology. We believe confident voices. We defer to perceived expertise. We accept correction from people who seem to know more than we do, even when they don't. These are not weaknesses. They are features that served our species well for hundreds of thousands of years. In the environments we evolved in, the problem is that they can be exploited. They were exploited systematically by people who understood them as tools. The defense, the only real defense, is awareness. Know that when you are tired, your judgment is compromised. Know that when you are isolated, your perception of reality narrows. Know that when someone in authority tells you something with great confidence, your instinct is to believe it, and that instinct is not always right. Know these things about yourself, and they become significantly harder to use against you. That is not a complete defense. There is no complete defense, but it is the beginning of one. The men and women who designed these 20 programs understood human psychology deeply. The least we can do is understand ourselves as well as they understood us.